Hello everyone, can you guys hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Oh, okay, good. All right. So just give me 1 second. Let me share my screen. You see my screen?
I say you're not audible, sir.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir, we can hear you now. Thank you, sir. Please go ahead.
Sorry about that. Okay. All right. So today we are going to talk about managed Kubernetes, right? We are going to talk about how we can create a Kubernetes cluster without worrying about managing the master. And we are going to use AWS for that. So we have already seen how to set up a Kubernetes cluster. We have already talked about AWS in our previous webinars. What is AWS and how do we make use of it? Today, we are going to make use of AWS to set up a managed Kubernetes cluster. So traditionally, when you set up a cluster, what do? You take some machines, right? Let's say these are some machines which have some operating systems installed. And what you do is you create a cluster out of them, right? So for example, there are 4 machines here. And on one machine, you make it as a master, or also known as control plane. Right? And on this control plane machine, you install all Kubernetes components. So API server, and then kube scheduler, and then your etcd, controller manager, things like that. You install all these tools. And then on all the nodes, you go ahead and install kubelet, right? So one kubelet here, and kubelet here, and kubelet here, and kubelet here, right? And then you initialize your cluster. You give this node the role of the control plane, right? And then finally connect all these nodes together and create a cluster out of it. And then we use an external tool called Cubectl. Right? We use external tool called Cubectl, and we use Cubectl to talk to the control plane, run all Cubectl commands to create or manage our Kubernetes resources like deployments or services or any other application that you want to deploy. right? That's the traditional way of deploying. And generally we use this on-premise deployment, where we have our own infrastructure, our own data centers, which has servers or virtual machines, and we want to set up the infrastructure on our own. So we use this approach, manually bringing up all the components. The advantage of this approach is that you have complete control over master. You can upgrade as and when you wish. You can scale it up, scale it down as and when you wish. But there is a big disadvantage. And the disadvantage is you have to, as an administrator, you would have to then manage all these components. You will have to manage all the components of the cluster, your API server, scheduler, etcd, controller manager, your certificates. Everything has to be managed by you. And this setup is good for playing around, for setting up clusters for your hobbies or for your projects. But for enterprise environment, you want to do more than that. You do not want possible downtimes of the cluster, or you do not want complex maintenance of the servers, right? So you want something that is sustainable. So for that, am I audible? Is my audio clear? Right. Okay. And is there any confusion about the topic that we are going to cover today? I'm getting some messages that today's subject is overview of AWS EKS. That's what we are talking about. Right? Okay. I hope we are all on the same page here. Okay, let's go back. So now, how do we get a more mature Kubernetes cluster, especially when we are on a cloud platform, for example, AWS or Azure or any cloud platform? Each cloud platform these days offers a managed Kubernetes service. What does that mean? That means that if you want, you can create a Kubernetes cluster on a cloud infrastructure or a cloud provider's infrastructure. On this setup, the Kubernetes master and everything required to set up the cluster is owned and managed by the cloud service provider. So if you have AWS and if you say, I want to create a managed Kubernetes service, which on AWS is called EKS, then when you create an EKS, you don't have to deal about how do I set up my master, how do I ensure that there is enough resources available for my master, how do I install all the components of my master, how do I renew the CA certificates of my master, how do I ensure that required network infrastructure is available, the CNI is available, how do I integrate with other AWS services like storage or network services. Everything comes built in. You just say, hey, AWS, I want a Kubernetes cluster, and you get it. Right? So that's what we are going to do. So for AWS, we have a solution called Elastic Kubernetes Service, right? Which is short for EKS, right? So we are going to talk about EKS today. What is EKS and how do we set it up? And we'll see a little bit of an example. We will also deploy maybe some Kubernetes deployments or resources there, right? So Elastic Kubernetes service. What does it mean? So when you go to your, for example, an AWS account, let's open the browser. Where did it go? Yeah. And if you go to your AWS account, now we have already talked about AWS and all the related services. So if you go to your AWS account and if you click on services, you can see, for example, let's click on compute. We don't have it here. Yeah, containers. If you go to containers, you will see Elastic Kubernetes service, right? So let's click on that. And using this service, we can create a managed Kubernetes cluster, right? So there are two components of a managed Kubernetes cluster. When you create a managed Kubernetes cluster, you essentially create a master. You create a control plane. That's it. EKS means control plane. So the control plane is what you get when you create a Kubernetes service, and the control plane is guaranteed for its uptime and for its stability by AWS, right? But your Kubernetes cluster is not just control plane. You also have worker nodes. So you create control plane, and then you bring your own worker nodes. You attach your own worker nodes to this cluster, right? You attach your own worker nodes to this cluster. Now it's very simple process. You don't have to do it manually, create instances and attach them. They can automatically be attached, right? So let's create a control plane or a master server, and then we'll attach some nodes to it. So you go to EKS, and you see here, first thing is pricing. Now EKS is not free. Like any resource in AWS is not free. Some resources are free if you are under free tier, but if you cross that, you have to pay for resources, right? So EKS resources is not free. If you create a EKS control plane or EKS master server, you have to pay, I think, 10 cents every day, even if you don't use it, right? We can go and look at the pricing here. Oh, 10 cents an hour. So if you set up your Kubernetes control plane, you have to pay 10 cents an hour just for it to exist. You use it or don't use it, doesn't matter. Just for it to exist, you have to pay 10 cents an hour. So if you keep your cluster running for one day, you will end up spending $2.4 per day for that, which may sound like nominal amount, but if you compare it with Azure Kubernetes service, you can create Kubernetes servers for free, control planes for free. You only have to pay for the nodes. Okay, so the control plane is priced. Also, the worker nodes have a price. So if you want to attach some worker nodes here, you have to pay for that. And that is same as your EC2 pricing. How much you pay for your EC2 instances, you just have to pay that. Okay, all right. There's something called as Fargate, which we will talk about later if time permits. So now let's create a cluster. Let's say create, and now we give our cluster a name. Let's call it as SkillUpRight, for example. And then we have to choose which Kubernetes version we want to set up. So we'll just choose the default one, 1.21. The latest Kubernetes version is 1.23, but AWS is still on 1.21, understandably. Then we have to choose some role, right? Which role should be assigned to this AWS cluster so that it can manage AWS services, right? So we assign it EKS cluster role, which is perfectly fine. And then we can say, do we want to encrypt all the contents of Kubernetes system, Kubernetes servers, or the secrets using Kubernetes? We can do that. For now, we will not do it because it's just for demonstration. We can also give it some tags, like some, if it is for a particular team or if it serves some specific purpose, we can give it a tag. Let's click on next. And then in which VPC should it run? So we can choose the VPC. We have a default VPC, so it runs there. And from that VPC, it picks up all the subnets. So we are going to run the control plane on these subnets. Then which security group should use? I already have a security group, so I'll use that. And we want IPv4 addresses, not IPv6. So IPv4 will be there by default, right? And then if you remember, we also, whenever we set up Kubernetes cluster, we use a CNI to set up the networking inside the cluster. And we also can optionally configure what should be the IP address ranges of services, right? So we can do that here as well, or we can leave it to default. Now I will leave it to default here. Now there is an option. What's the exposure that you want to give to your API server or your control plane? Should it be accessible from outside of AWS cluster? So, or outside of your VPC? So that means, do you want to make it public? Anyone with your endpoint IP address and port number with correct authentication can log into the cluster, right? So you can do that. Or if you want to be only make this EKS control plane accessible from within your VPC, which is highly secure, then you say, I want to keep it private, right? Or you can say, I want to keep my control plane public, but my nodes private. So this is the most optimal solution that you should choose. But because we are going demonstration, we will choose everything public. And then which network interface you want? We want Amazon's interface because that's going to give us integration with other Amazon services. We want core DNS, we want kubeproxy, all set to default. And do we want to generate some logs? Yeah, maybe we want to generate some logs for API server or for controller manager or scheduler. So we can do that as well. We can enable them and the logs will go in CloudWatch. Right now, I'm just going to let it disabled. And then finally, we get an option that this is a summary. Do we want to create this? And let's say, yes, let's create it. So we create it. Now this takes some time. You see the cluster is being created. And this is the cluster information. So 1.21 Kubernetes version and the platform version, EKS version is EKS.6. That does not give us much of an information, but yeah. So now it is creating. It may take anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes. All right. Okay. Let this be ongoing. Now there is one problem with this creation. The problem is that you have to click on so many user interfaces, so many web pages, and then provide so many information. Isn't there a quicker way to create your EKS cluster? A way where we can just run one command or maybe one liner and we can get our EKS cluster by providing all these options. So yes, there is a way. There is also a tool called as eksctl, which is known as EKS Control. It is developed by Weave Networks, and it is officially the command line tool for managing Elastic Kubernetes service clusters, right? It is the official client identified by Amazon or AWS for creating the cluster. Okay, so I will show you how you can use EKS or eksctl for creating your cluster. So first thing is we need to install EKS. So let's look for EKS documentation. Right. So the first option is installing EKSCTL, installing kubectl and EKSCTL. Let's install EKSCTL. So let's go to that installation link. And it says on Linux machine, you can just download the EKSCTL binary and you should be good to go. So I'm going to copy this command and go to my Linux machine. You can do it on Windows also by following the Windows guide. I run this command. Hopefully it works. It works maybe. Let's say /tmp in tmp directory. We have EKSCTL downloaded. We have this EKSCTL now downloaded. Then I move it into my path. like this. Copy this. This downloads eksctl for me. If I say eksctl version, I should get some output. So I have eksctl version 0.933.0 with me. Right? Now, we can use eksctl for creating a cluster. Right? The command is simple: eksctl create and then cluster. eksctl create cluster. Yeah. The problem with this command is, or the problem right now that we are getting is that it cannot authenticate, fail to retrieve credentials. Yeah, there are no credentials on the system, so it cannot talk to AWS services. Right. So let's get some credentials here. Now to get the credentials, we are going to use AWS CLI. Right, there is a command line interface for complete AWS as well. And let's download that. That's going to help us in getting the credentials. Okay, so AWS CLI, let's install it. Linux. So here, if you want to install it on Linux, must be like this. We download this zip file, unzip it, and then install it. That's all. So I'm going to copy it. And that's it. Yeah. So just run this command to get AWS CLI. And then perform AWS install. Done. Now, if I say AWS, we have a command line tool to interact with AWS as well. Right? Now, AWS command line tool gives us option for AWS configure. And with this AWS configure command, I can save the credentials on my local machine so that those credentials can be used to connect to AWS services. eksctl, Terraform, AWS CLI all use these credentials. So now I need to save the credentials. Let me generate the credentials. Okay, so I go to my AWS account and I click on my account and I go to security credentials. And here I generate the access key and the access ID. This is sensitive information, but this allows some programming. I'm going to delete the existing one. I'm going to create a new key, and this allows for accessing AWS via CLI tools. Okay, so access key ID, I'm going to save that here. When I run AWS configure command, it asks me to provide the access key ID. Here you go. Then access key, here you go. And then the region, so I say AP South. This is the region I want to work here, and the output should be in default output format. I'll just choose none. So yeah, with AWS configure command, I can save the credentials in this on this system. Now, if I say EKS create cluster, it's going to start creating the cluster, and And it will do that by talking to my AWS account using the credentials that I just saved. Okay, now this AWS create cluster is going to create the cluster with default configurations. We don't want that. So we say, let's print the help statement. What are things we can do here? So let me maximize this window, and you can provide all these options for EKS cluster creation, right? So you can provide the name to your cluster. You can provide which time zone it should be in. You can provide nodes, for example. So things like that. Yeah. So I will say EKS create cluster, and then I say nodes, and I say I want 2 nodes on that cluster. Right now I say 2 nodes, but then I need to also say what type of nodes. By default, it's going to take some, let's see, let me tell you, instance, yeah, instance type. Yeah, by default, it takes, I think, C4 large or C5 large. I don't remember correctly, but I will say instant type is going to be T2 micro. I just want T2 micro instances, or I said T2 large. And I give this cluster a name. Let's say SkillUpRight. I just give this name. Created via eksctl, for example. So I say eksctl create cluster. I'll remove this help option here with 2 nodes, and the node should have instance type T2 large, and you should use the name sur eksctl, or maybe I'll make it better with SkillUpRight eksctl. So name the cluster SkillUpRight eksctl. Press enter. Now you see eksctl will, with just this one command, it's going to talk to AWS account and bring up our cluster. It uses internally CloudFormation. So you can see here, if you know what is CloudFormation, you will understand that it internally uses some sort of infrastructure as code tool, which is CloudFormation for AWS, to get the cluster up, right? So eksctl is generally used for automatically creating new clusters. But if you want GUI, you can also use GUI like we used here, right? So now if we go back here, we see that it is still being created and it is now active. Yeah, just give me 1 second. Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, so for screen, I'm not sure for what can I do for clarity of the screen. I am running it on full screen. It's a 1080p screen. You should be able to see it. But otherwise, I think Vinod, maybe you can help people. Maybe you guys can make it full screen and see if it works out better. Yeah. Okay, one thing is there may be some questions here which I may not see. So I'll open the floor for questions in a bit. Okay, then I will answer the questions. So you can see here, this was the cluster which we created from GUI. So if I go to EKS and clusters, if I go to the home page, you see SkillUpRight cluster is already created, right? Which we created via GUI. And the cluster is up. You can see the complete details about the cluster. You can see the cluster endpoint. So this is where your API server is, right? and then you can use your kubectl to connect to this cluster, right? But if you click on compute, you will see there are no nodes here. There are no nodes here. So as I said, when you create a EKS, you get a control plane and you have to create your own nodes. When you use GUI to create EKS service, it is like this. You get a control plane and then you add your nodes as well. But with eksctl, it will also create nodes for you. So eksctl is one shot. But with GUI, you have to create nodes separately. So nodes are available in node groups. So you can see here in the node groups, there are no nodes. Only master is there right now. Right. So I'd say add a node group. So here the name of the node groups is, let's say, SkillUpRight NG. I will just call it as NG. And for the nodes, what is the role that I want to give? I want to give them a role called EKS node so that it has desired permissions to attach itself to Kubernetes cluster and all that. And if I want, I can give an EC2 template with default configurations, but right now I'm just going to use no extra template, just default images. And then if I want to add some labels to this, if I want to add some taints or some tags, I can do that. Right now, I don't want to do it. Let's go to next. And then what kind of nodes I want to attach. So AMI type, that means what is the operating system for the nodes. I can say use Ubuntu or something, but it has only two options, Bottle Rocket and Amazon Linux. So I'll just go with default. Then capacity, what kind of capacity? I want to have spot reservations or on demand. On demand is always good. And then instance type, I can choose. The default is T3 medium, right? But I can choose any other instance type, maybe T2 micro or whatever is required. Okay. Anyways, and then the disk space is 20 GB. So these are all default values. If I create the cluster and I create a node group like this, then I will get this. Then this is very interesting, node group scaling configurations. So you can specify how many nodes you want at minimum in the cluster. I can say minimum, I want 5 nodes all the time running. But if the load on the nodes go high, scale it up to 10 nodes, right? Automatically scale it up. So you have scalability. So I say minimum is 5, maximum is 10. And how many nodes I want to start with, right? Initially, how many nodes I want. So by default it is equal to the minimum that you want. So I'll just keep it simple. I'll say 1 node, and the maximum is also 1 node. So yeah, keep it simple. I want to save some cost, right? Okay. And then click on next. Finally, in which subnets? All right. It's the same VPC as the cluster, as the control plane and the subnets. There are no labels that I'm applying, no taints. I'm giving some configurations, blah, blah, blah. And finally, I can click on create. And when I click on create, it's going to create a node group. And that node group or set of nodes will be attached to the cluster. Right? So if I click on now SkillUpRight cluster, if you go to compute, there is one node group already created, right? And the desired side is 1. And the status is creating. So that means nodes are coming up. Okay, let's take a look at our CLI. Our CLI is still running. It will take some time. And if I refresh this, the node group is still being created. Okay, it is still creating. In the meanwhile, yeah, it is still creating. I want to show you something. Okay, so now the cluster, when it will be created, we will use it. Okay, for example, we can see in the cluster, SkillUpRight cluster. Let's go back again and let's come back here. And here we see workloads, right? That means in the cluster, what are the workloads running? So there is daemon set running called as AWS node. There is one core DNS running. There is one kube proxy running. Right? In all namespaces you can see here, all the resources are running on kube system. Right? I'll just close these notifications. And if I go to overview, now you see there is a node also added automatically to this SkillUpRight cluster. So now we have the cluster, and in the cluster there is one worker node. Now we need to work with the cluster. Unfortunately, the EKS does not have any interface for creating deployments or pods or things like that. You have to use Cubectl. Okay, so let's use Cubectl now. So first thing is, if we go to EKS documentation, there is also a guide for installing Cubectl, right? Or we can go to Kubernetes documentation to install Cubectl. Installing Cubectl, I'll just go to the guide here. It will also be pretty simple as just running a curl command. Yeah. So I can run this curl command and I can copy this file somewhere, and I will get Cubectl. So you can follow this documentation to install Cubectl. I can see if I have Cubectl already available for me. I will open another terminal. Yep. And become root. And I say Cubectl. There is a Cubectl available. Let me also check the version of Cubectl. It is 1.20. So this is fine, right? So I am on Cubectl version 1.20. You can install it from this documentation. I already have it installed. Now, when I run this Cubectl command, it says you must be logged into a server. I do not have any server now. I need to run my Cubectl command against this cluster which I created. I want to explore this cluster using Cubectl. So I want to get this information of this cluster in my Cubectl's kubeconfig file, right? So there, AWS CLI comes very handy. So I can say AWS EKS, and then let's say for EKS, what options they have. So I know the option AWS EKS update config, update kube config. AWS EKS update kube config. All right. So I want to add data to my kube config, but for which server? Okay, I want to add for the cluster called, maybe I'll just copy the name for this cluster, right? And then where is this cluster, in which region? So I say region AP South 1. So find the cluster in the region AP South 1 with the name SkillUpRight and add it in my kube config. Press enter. It added the context. You see, so it added the context, this username to, and this cluster here. So if now I say Cubectl get nodes, I run this command, you see I can see the nodes in my cluster. right? I can describe this node as well. Cubectl describe node. This one. And I can see more details about this node. So this node has, when we go to capacity, it has 2 CPUs and too much of memory. So around 4 GB of memory. Yeah, not too much also. 4 GB of memory. And one more interesting thing is you should see number of pods. So it can run 17 pods. So from AWS, each node type has a limitation on how many pods it can run. For example, T2 Micro can run 4 pods, but this one, maybe T3 Small that we used, runs 17 pods. Okay, and if we see pods, how many pods are running? Cubectl get pods in all namespaces. You can see these pods are running. Right? So you can explore your cluster now. Your Cubectl is connected to your EKS cluster. But when you do a Cubectl get nodes, you only see the worker node. You don't see where is your master, right? Because that is out of your control. When you have managed Kubernetes services, the master, you lose the access to master. You don't have master. I mean, you have, but you don't have access to the master. You just manage your nodes. All right. Okay. So here you can also create maybe a deployment. So you can say kubectl create deployment. And let's give the deployment, let's say example deployment. And then let's give it a name. Let's give it an image nginx. And that's all. This command is going to create a deployment called example deployment. Now, if I go to my cluster and if I go to workloads, let's refresh. Now you see an example deployment is created. I click on that and I see that example deployment is running. It has created a pod. Pod is running. And if I go to this pod, I can see on which node it is running. It is running on this node. The IP address of the pod, I can figure out somewhere here, hopefully. It is running one container called nginx. Where is the IP address of the pod? Maybe raw view. Yeah. So here, if we can get some IP address information. Yeah, so it has its IP address here, 172.31.37.220. Yeah, so yeah, this is how you create a pod now, right? And you can expose it. You can create a service and access this this application also. So you can say kubectl expose deployment and example deployment, right? And you say that the type of the service is, let's say, load balancer. The capital L, capital B. And with this, you will get a service. It says example, expose deployment. Okay, for some reason, the deployment is not available. Why does it say that? It runs. And it is in which namespace? Namespace default should be okay. right, just give me 1 second. All right, I figured out the problem. So when I say kubectl config get context, you see this cluster is also created, and when I use eksctl to create this cluster, it automatically updates the kubeconfig file. So the kubeconfig file started pointing to this particular cluster, which is SkillUpRight eksctl, right, which we created using eksctl. So that's why commands were going there. I say kubectl expose deployment example deployment and type load balancer, but I say that use the context this one to run this command, so that the command goes to the correct cluster. Deployment. All right, port is 80. So you see, now a service is created. If I say kubectl get service, this example deployment service is created, and you get an external endpoint, right? And this external endpoint can be used to access your application. So if I go to this browser and wait for a few minutes, maybe 1 or 2 minutes, we can access this application. Yeah, so this is how you can deploy your applications. So 2 ways to create a cluster. One is via GUI and one is via CLI. With GUI, you have to follow a lot of steps. You have to click on various web pages, click on next, and then then get a cluster, and then manually add some nodes to a node group and then get nodes. But with CLI, you get everything in an instant, right? And also your kubeconfig is updated with the EKS CLI command, eksctl command. All right, so this is how you create the cluster. What do you do when you are done with the cluster? So I created the cluster, I created my deployments, and now I am done, right? Now, if I don't need the cluster anymore, okay, the application is still not available. Maybe give it some time, we will get it. But if you don't need a cluster anymore, just delete it, right? So if I go to my cluster homepage, I see one cluster is created. If I refresh, I should get actually 2 clusters. One was created by GUI, one was created via eksctl. So both are here now, right? And if my job is done for both the clusters, then I can simply delete them. Now remember, when you delete a cluster, you also have to delete the node groups. Okay, So don't just delete the cluster, delete node groups also. So if I go to EKS, this EKS cluster, I have to first delete the node groups, then delete the cluster. Okay. Also, by the way, you can access the application here. You see, welcome to Nginx is here. Anyways, so now I go to this node group here. This node group here, I'll open it in a new tab. And I will delete it. Yeah, so just delete this node group. Confirmation. Deleted. So this node group will be deleted. That means all the nodes in this node group will be deleted. Right? It is deleting. And once you are doing that, you go back to your cluster and then delete the cluster as well. So first delete your node group, then delete the cluster. I say delete this cluster. So you have to take care of deleting the cluster, right? So yeah, it has node group attached. So I don't know how much time it will take to delete it. Yeah, it will take some time. Let's give it some time. And then you delete the cluster. But then if you had created the cluster with eksctl, you don't have to worry about all these things. You can just say eksctl delete cluster. And the name of the cluster that you want to delete is SkillUpRight eksctl. Right? You can print some health statement also. You can give the name of the cluster. If you want to specify a specific region, you can give that as well, or many other things. Yeah. So I just say delete the cluster. And this is going to delete the node group and the clusters. Yeah. So you see here, it is going to will drain the unmanaged node group and then delete the node group and then the cluster. Also, from your kube config, it is going to remove the entry for this cluster. So you see the cleanup is done. eksctl is really good in setting up the cluster and setting up your whole environment. All right, that's all I wanted to cover. Now we can take some questions. Let's see what is happening to this node group. I can take some questions for maybe 5 minutes and then we wrap up. Do we lose any control when we use EKS instead of Kubernetes cluster directly? Yes, you do not control your master. You cannot make any changes to your master control plane. I mean API control. No, you have complete control over a cluster. It depends on the roles or the cluster role binding that you have, right? By default, you get all the admin privileges. Have you created the role or it was already there? I did not create any role. The role already exists for EKS nodes and EKS clusters. What is the advantage of using EKS? I have already mentioned this before, but again, advantage is that if you use EKS, you have tight integration with AWS services. For example, when we created our Kubernetes service as type load balancer, you got a load balancer instance or load balanced IP address or DNS name. You can directly expose your applications there. You do not have to worry about getting an external load balancer and getting the services. So tight integration with AWS services, complete management is offloaded to AWS, so you don't have to manage the complete cluster. And yeah, major advantages are these only. Any more questions before we disconnect? All right, so no questions. Then thank you for your time today. Thank you for the opportunity. Hopefully the 1 hour that you spent with me was meaningful. And I will see you in the next session. Yeah. There is one question. Do we need to have similar EKS implementation for different environments? Is there any ways to do it? If you are talking about like development and staging and production environment, then you can create separate clusters, or you can create separate namespaces within a cluster, right? That also is possible. What is the difference between EKS and Helm? Okay, Helm is entirely different tool. Helm is used to package your AWS, sorry, not AWS, Kubernetes YAML files or YAML templates so that they can be reused. Yeah, some other time we will also talk about Helm. Is load balancing across nodes in node groups? Yes, load balancing is there. We need to access node or node group. You don't need to access anything. You just use Cubectl. Will there be any impact of API gateway if EKS is used? I don't think so. I observed you are doing all the operations using root user. Can it be done by non-root user? Yep, you can do all these operations with non-root user. I just use root user because there are a lot of install commands. I needed to, put the eksctl and AWS CLI at the right places. So a lot of privilege access was required. That's why we have it like that. Okay. Okay, guys, we are over time. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you. Okay, there is Q&A. Somebody says check Q&A space. How the recording link will be sent. Recording. We have, I think, answered many of the questions. In what way eksctl better than EKS UI, which is far more intuitive than command line interface? All automation, time saving. UI you can use, but if you have to create 10 instances, 10 clusters, then good luck. But with command line, you can automate stuff. How the EKS clusters are different from EC2 instances? I already answered this. Okay, guys, thank you. I think we are already over time. And I will see you again some other time with some other topic. Till then, take care. Bye-bye.